Imagine sitting at your family's Thanksgiving table. The smell of roasted turkey is in the air, the fine china is set, and suddenly, your own sister stands up, pulls out a pair of cold steel handcuffs, and arrests you right in front of your mother. No warning. Just a forged document, a room full of smug relatives, and a desperate grab for the family inheritance. She thought she was humiliating a fraud. She thought she had finally won. But what she didn't know was that the local police captain she called for backup used to be my subordinate in military intelligence. And when he walked through that front door, he didn't read me my rights. He stood at attention, gave a crisp military salute, and said three words that shattered her entire world. General, stand down. In today's story, you will discover that true power never has to shout, and the ultimate victory isn't about destroying those who hurt you. It's about having the strength to show mercy when they expect vengeance. They say that blood is thicker than water, but nobody ever warns you that sometimes. The very people who share your blood will use it to drown you. My name is Eleanor Vance. For over 20 years, I have served my country in silence, navigating the treacherous waters of military intelligence, commanding troops, and making decisions that altered the course of global security. But as I drove my rental car down the winding, leaf-strewn roads of upstate New York, I felt a familiar, suffocating knot tightening in my chest. The hardest battle of my life was not going to take place in a war zone half a world away. It was waiting for me at my mother's oak dining table on Thanksgiving Day. The town of Willow Creek had not changed since the day I left it. The same quaint storefronts lined Main Street, decorated with faded autumn bunting. And the same towering oak trees stood like ancient sentinels guarding secrets that everyone knew but no one spoke about. Pulling into the driveway of my childhood home, I killed the engine and just sat there for a moment, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the cooling motor. The house looked picture perfect. A white colonial with a wraparound porch and a wreath of dried orange leaves hanging on the front door. But to me, it felt like a courthouse. I had not been back for 5 years, not since my father's funeral, and in my absence. The narrative of who I was had been completely rewritten by those I left behind. To the United States government, I was a brigadier general. To my family, I was Eleanor, the rebellious, selfish daughter who had abandoned them for a mysterious, dead-end government desk job. Taking a deep breath, stepped out of the car, pulling my wool coat tightly around my shoulders to ward off the biting November chill. The moment I pushed the front door open, the overwhelming scent of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and simmering cranberries washed over me. A cruel reminder of the warmth this house was supposed to hold. In the foyer, my mother, Margaret, stood wringing her hands nervously. She looked older. Her shoulders stooped under the invisible weight she always seemed to carry. When she saw me, a fleeting look of genuine relief crossed her fragile features before it was quickly masked by anxiety. I pulled her into a gentle hug, feeling how frail she had become. I wanted to tell her everything, to tell her she was safe. But before the words could form, heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed from the hallway. My younger sister, Claire, stepped into the light. She was wearing her police uniform, the silver badge of a local sergeant pinned proudly to her chest, gleaming like a warning sign. Her jaw was set, her eyes sharp and devoid of the sisterly affection we had shared as little girls catching fireflies by the creek. To Claire, I was a failure. A woman who couldn't even be bothered to come home to help care for our aging mother. She didn't offer a hug or even a handshake. Instead, she crossed her arms, her gaze sweeping over my simple civilian clothes with undisguised contempt. The tension in the hallway was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You actually showed up," Claire said, her voice dripping with the icy sarcasm that made my heart ache. "I figured you'd be too busy pushing paper in Washington to make time for your actual family." I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing my voice to remain calm and steady. "It's Thanksgiving. Claire, I wanted to be here. I wanted to see Mom. And I wanted to see you. before Claire could fire back another insult. A smooth, overly confident voice boomed from the living room. Uncle Richard emerged, holding a crystal glass of bourbon, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my mother's monthly mortgage payment. Since my father passed, Richard had positioned himself as the patriarch, taking total control of the family trust and my mother's finances. I never trusted him. Beneath his charming smile and expensive cologne hid a manipulative, greedy man who viewed our family's estate as his personal piggy bank. He offered me a wide, predatory smile, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Eleanor, my dear, welcome home," Richard purred, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. "We have so much to discuss tonight. Family business, you understand." The dining room table was set with my grandmother's fine china, a beautiful facade masking the toxic undercurrent of the evening. As we sat down to eat, the conversation felt like walking through a minefield. Claire relentlessly poked at my life, throwing passive-aggressive jabs about my supposed lack of career progression, my lack of a husband, and my absence during our mother's recent health scares. I did not fight back with arrogance. I did not pull rank or brag about my clearance level. Instead, I let my vulnerability show. I tried to ask Claire about her life on the force, hoping to find common ground, hoping to reach the sister I used to protect from thunderstorms. But every olive branch I extended was snapped in half. I looked at my mother, silently begging her to intervene, to be the peacemaker, but she just stared down at her plate, a prisoner in her own home. As the dessert plates were cleared, the stifling atmosphere reached its breaking point. Uncle Richard placed his bourbon glass on the table with a heavy thud, the sound echoing through the quiet room. He adjusted his silk tie and looked across the table at Claire, giving her a subtle, confirming nod. The air in the room suddenly felt dangerously thin. Claire's posture shifted, her spine straightening as a look of righteous triumph illuminated her face. Whatever ambush they had planned for me, whatever cruel trap they had set to finally push me out of this family, the spring was about to snap. Claire stood up slowly, the legs of her wooden dining chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. The sound sent a primal shiver down my spine. From the side pocket of her dark uniform trousers, she pulled out a thick, crumpled manila envelope and tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed right next to the remnants of the cranberry sauce, a stark, ugly intrusion upon our Thanksgiving dinner. My mother gasped softly, her trembling hands clutching her linen napkin as she looked back and forth between her two daughters. Uncle Richard leaned back in his chair, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips, savoring the destruction he had orchestrated. "What is this, Claire?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. "That," Claire spat, her eyes flashing with a toxic mixture of anger and desperate vindication, "is the truth. The truth about you, Eleanor. Since Mom was too blind to see it, and Dad isn't here to protect us anymore. Uncle Richard and I took it upon ourselves to do a little digging. You've been lying to us for years." She reached out and snatched the documents from the envelope, spreading them out for my mother to see. They were bank statements, heavily doctored to show massive, crushing debts, alongside a terrifyingly official-looking document bearing a fake military seal. It was a notice of dishonorable discharge, stamped with bright red ink, citing financial fraud and gross misconduct. I stared at the papers in absolute disbelief. The sheer audacity of the forgery was staggering. Uncle Richard had outdone himself. He had manufactured a complete, devastating lie to frame me, ensuring that I would be legally and morally disinherited from the family trust before I could ever audit his embezzling hands. "You're not a government employee," Claire announced loudly, her voice trembling with misplaced righteous fury. "You were kicked out of the military years ago in disgrace. You're broke. You're a fraud. And you came back here to bleed Mom dry." The betrayal hit me harder than physical violence. It wasn't the lies that broke my heart, but the realization that my own sister hated me enough to believe them without a single question. I looked at Claire, tears hot and unbidden welling up in my eyes. "Claire, please," I pleaded. letting my vulnerability bleed into the quiet room. Look at me. Look at your sister. You know me. You know I would never do this to our family. Richard is manipulating you to hide what he has done to Dad's estate. Don't you dare blame Richard, Claire shouted, her hand dropping instinctively to the utility belt at her waist. He's been the only one here for us while you were out living your pathetic, imaginary life. My mother began to weep openly, burying her face in her hands, completely paralyzed by the escalating nightmare. Richard just sighed, shaking his head with mock pity. It's tragic, really, he murmured, to see a woman stoop so low. Sergeant Vance, I believe you have a duty to perform. Claire didn't hesitate. Her eyes were hard, unyielding stones. She unclipped the metal handcuffs from her belt, the sharp, metallic clinking sound echoing loudly in the dining room. She walked around the table, grabbed my arm with shocking force, and yanked me to my feet. I did not resist. I let her turn me around, the cold steel biting painfully into my wrists as she locked the cuffs tightly behind my back. The physical sensation of being arrested in my childhood home by my own sister was a surreal, agonizing nightmare. Eleanor Vance, you are under arrest for financial fraud and the federal crime of impersonating a government officer, Claire recited, her voice echoing with the hollow authority she so desperately craved. She reached for her shoulder radio, her thumb pressing down on the transmission button. Dispatch, this is Sergeant Vance. Requesting an immediate backup unit at my 1020. We have a felony arrest. And I want a transport vehicle here now. She wanted an audience. She wanted the neighbors to see the flashing lights, to see me dragged out in disgrace, permanently cementing her role as the family savior and my role as the ultimate villain. I stood there, bound and humiliated, the tears finally spilling over my eyelashes and tracing hot paths down my cheeks. Not out of fear, but out of a profound, devastating sorrow for the shattered pieces of my family that could never be glued back together in the same way. Minutes ticked by in agonizing silence, broken only by my mother's quiet sobs. Then, the piercing wail of police sirens cut through the cold November night, growing rapidly louder until red and blue lights began flashing violently through the sheer curtains of the living room windows. Heavy boots pounded up the wooden steps of the front porch. The front door was pushed open with aggressive force, letting in a gust of freezing wind. Claire puffed out her chest, turning to greet her arriving colleagues with a victorious smile. But the man who walked through the door was not a rookie patrol officer. It was Captain Robert Miller, the commanding officer of the local precinct. His face was set in a grim, professional mask as he stepped into the foyer, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. He surveyed the chaotic dining room, the crying mother, the smug uncle, the forged documents scattered on the fine china, and finally, his sergeant standing over a handcuffed woman. But as his eyes locked onto my face, the professional mask shattered completely. He froze, the color draining rapidly from his cheeks as an entirely different kind of shock registered in his eyes. The trap had been sprung, but neither Claire nor Richard realized that they were the ones standing inside it. Captain Robert Miller stood absolutely motionless in the entryway of my childhood home, the harsh red and blue lights from his cruiser outside casting frantic, erratic shadows across his weathered face. For a fleeting second, the room was suspended in a breathless vacuum. Claire was still puffing her chest out, her hand resting triumphantly on her utility belt, waiting for her commanding officer to validate her grand performance. Uncle Richard was swirling the last sip of his bourbon, his gleaming with the predatory satisfaction of a man who believed he had just checkmated his only threat. But I did not look at them. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Robert. I had not seen him in nearly a decade. Not since a grueling deployment in the Middle East, where he had been a young, fiercely loyal lieutenant under my direct command in the intelligence sector. He had aged, the gray creeping into his temples. But the sharp, analytical mind behind those eyes remained unchanged. I saw the exact moment the puzzle pieces violently clicked together in his head, the color drained from his face, replaced instantly by an expression of profound shock and deeply ingrained military reverence. Before Claire could utter another word of her fabricated triumph, Captain Miller did something that shattered the reality of everyone else in the room. He bypassed the local law enforcement protocol entirely, drew his shoulders back, snapped his boots together, and delivered a crisp, perfect military salute. "General," he said, his voice carrying the heavy, unmistakable cadence of absolute respect. The single word dropped into the dining room like a live grenade. Claire blinked, her mouth opening and closing as her brain desperately tried to process the impossible scene unfolding in front of her. "Captain," she stammered, her voice suddenly sounding very small, very juvenile. "What are you doing?" I called for backup. "This woman is a fraud. I have the federal discharge papers right here on the table." Captain Miller lowered his hand, turning his gaze slowly toward Claire. The professional warmth he usually reserved for his officers was completely gone, replaced by a terrifying icy fury. "Sergeant Vance, stand down," he barked, his voice echoing off the floral wallpaper. "Stand down right now and take those handcuffs off her immediately. You have absolutely no idea what you have just done." "But she's a criminal," Claire protested, her voice rising in a panic as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "She stole from Mom. Look at the papers. Those papers are garbage." Captain Miller growled, stepping fully into the room and pointing a stern finger directly at my sister's chest. "You just unlawfully detained Brigadier General Eleanor Vance of United States Military Intelligence. She possesses a security clearance that you and I are not even allowed to read about. If you do not remove those cuffs this exact second, I will have you stripped of your badge and facing federal charges before midnight." The metallic clatter of Uncle Richard's crystal glass hitting the hardwood floor was the only sound that followed. Claire's face turned the color of ash. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled for the keys on her belt, her entire worldview collapsing around her in real time. She stepped behind me, the cold metal teeth of the handcuffs clicking in reverse, releasing my bruised wrists. I rubbed my arms slowly, rolling my shoulders as the circulation returned, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I did not gloat. I simply watched as the illusion Uncle Richard had carefully built began to burn to the ground, just as the handcuffs slipped away. The sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway signaled the arrival of a sleek, black government SUV. The front door opened again, and Major Sarah Hayes walked in. Sarah was my second in command, a brilliant, no-nonsense financial forensic analyst who had been tracking my uncle's movements for the past 6 months. She carried a thick, leather-bound folder bearing the authentic seal of the Department of Defense. Sarah took one look at the tension in the room, her eyes darting from the fake documents on the table to my bruised wrists, and a knowing, dangerous smile crossed her face. "I apologize for the intrusion, Margaret," Sarah said gently to my weeping mother, before turning a lethal glare toward Uncle Richard. "But we have a rather urgent matter to settle. Captain Miller, I am Major Hayes. The documents Sergeant Vance found were indeed forged, but not by the general. They were manufactured by the man standing by the fireplace." Sarah threw the heavy leather folder onto the table, right on top of the fake discharge papers. "These are the true financial logs. Richard Vance has systematically embezzled over $400,000 from this family's trust over the last 5 years. He funneled it through shell companies and drained Margaret's retirement accounts. When he realized General Vance was coming home and possessed the resources to audit the estate, he panicked and fabricated a smear campaign to have her legally disinherited and discredited. Richard tried to run. He bolted toward the back door leading to the kitchen, abandoning his tailored charm for the desperate cowardice of a trapped animal. But Captain Miller was faster. He tackled Richard into the doorframe, pinning his arms behind his back with practiced efficiency. As Captain Miller pulled out his own set of cuffs, the irony in the room was palpable. hanging thick and heavy in the stale Thanksgiving air. Claire collapsed into her dining chair, her face buried in her hands, sobbing with a mixture of terror and overwhelming shame. The truth was finally out, completely undeniable. But the wreckage it left behind in my childhood home was devastating. I looked at the broken pieces of my family, knowing that the hardest part was not uncovering the betrayal, but figuring out how to survive it. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the living room in a rhythmic, unforgiving cadence as Captain Miller escorted Uncle Richard out the front door. Richard's protests had devolved into pathetic, desperate begging, but no one was listening anymore. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving behind a suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of my mother's quiet, heartbroken weeping. Sarah Hayes offered me a silent nod, her expression softening with unspoken sympathy, before she tactfully stepped outside onto the porch to give us the privacy we so desperately needed. I was left standing in the center of the wreckage, the bruised rings on my wrists throbbing with a dull ache, staring at the sister who had just tried to destroy my life. Claire was trembling uncontrollably, her head bowed so low it practically touched the dining table. She looked utterly defeated, stripped of her pride, her arrogance, and her uniform's authority, by every metric of the law. I had the power to end her career right then and there. She had assaulted a commanding officer, committed unlawful detainment, and engaged in a conspiracy. Even if she had been manipulated into it, she was bracing for the blow. She was waiting for me to unleash my fury, to crush her the way she had tried to crush me. But as I looked at her, I didn't see a corrupt police officer. I saw the little girl who used to hide in my closet during thunderstorms, terrified of the loud noises, desperate for someone to make her feel safe. I pulled out the chair next to her and sat down. I reached across the table, gently moving the forged documents out of the way, and placed my hand over her trembling fingers. She flinched, expecting anger, but when she looked up, her tear-streaked face met with a gaze of quiet compassion. "I'm sorry," Claire choked out, the words scraping painfully from her throat. "Eleanor, I am so sorry. I was so angry that you left. I was so tired of taking care of Mom alone, of managing the bills, of feeling like I was drowning while you were out living some grand, important life. Richard told me you were just coming back to take whatever money was left. I wanted to protect us. I wanted to be the one who saved the family." "I know you did, Claire," I said softly, my voice steady and completely devoid of malice. "You acted out of pain, not out of hatred. You let your resentment blind you to the truth. And Richard used your vulnerability against you. He weaponized your exhaustion. Are you going to press charges?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a paralyzing fear. "Are you going to have Captain Miller take my badge? If there is one thing I've learned from commanding troops in the darkest corners of the world, it is that true power is not about destroying the people who hurt you," I told her, my grip on her hand tightening reassuringly. "True strength is having the capacity to show mercy when everyone expects vengeance. If I send you to prison, if I destroy your life just to satisfy my own ego, then I am no better than Uncle Richard. I would be prioritizing my pride over our family, and I have lost enough time with you already. I am not going to lose you again." My mother let out a loud, shuddering breath, rushing around the table to wrap her arms around both of us. For the first time in over a decade, the three of us held each other. The toxic secrets and manufactured lies finally washed away by the painful, necessary truth. It was not a magical, instant fix. Healing from that level of manipulation and betrayal would take years of difficult conversations, of rebuilding trust, and of setting strict, healthy boundaries. But as we sat together amidst the ruins of our Thanksgiving dinner, the air in the house finally felt breathable again. We live in a society that often tells us to immediately cut off anyone who offends us, to prioritize our own egos over human connection, and to view forgiveness as a form of weakness. But healing requires immense vulnerability. It requires us to look at the people who have profoundly hurt us, to recognize their flawed humanity, and to say, "I see your pain, but I will not let you pass it on to me. Equality and human dignity do not just exist in courtrooms or on battlefields. They start right at our own dining tables. Education and emotional intelligence mean recognizing when someone is acting out of deep-seated fear rather than malice. I protected my sister that night, not because she had earned it in that moment, but because compassion is an active, daily choice. We must champion human rights, respect, and equality. But we must also remember our shared human fragility. We are all capable of making terrible, blinding mistakes when we feel unloved or abandoned. Give the people you care about the grace to grow. But never be afraid to set the boundaries necessary to protect your own peace. As I watched the government SUV pull away later that night, taking Uncle Richard to face his long overdue justice, I looked up at the clear autumn sky. For the first time in a very long time, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. True power is quiet, true peace is earned, and true family is built on the courage to forgive. The morning after the storm always carries a strange, hollow kind of quiet when I woke up. The sun had not yet crested the horizon, leaving the town of Willow Creek bathed in the pale, icy blue light of a late November dawn. The house was completely silent. The frantic energy and flashing police lights of the previous night replaced by the heavy stillness of a reality that had fundamentally shifted. I slipped out of bed, pulling a thick woolen sweater over my shoulders, and quietly made my way downstairs. The wooden floorboards creaked under my bare feet, a familiar, comforting sound from a childhood I was finally beginning to understand with adult eyes. Walking into the dining room, the remnants of our disastrous Thanksgiving dinner were still scattered across the table. The crystal glass Uncle Richard had dropped lay shattered near the fireplace, its jagged pieces catching the faint morning light. The forged documents and the genuine federal files still rested next to the cold, untouched turkey. It looked like a museum exhibit dedicated to the exact moment my family's toxic illusions had finally shattered. I began to clean. There was something profoundly therapeutic about the mundane act of clearing the table. I threw the forged discharge papers into the trash without a second glance. I gathered the fine china, carried it into the kitchen, and turned on the hot water. As the sink filled with soap and steam, I heard the hesitant shuffle of slippers against the hallway floor. My mother, Margaret, stood in the doorway. She looked exhausted, the deep lines around her eyes reflecting decades of unspoken anxieties and swallowed words. She clutched a knitted shawl tightly around her chest, looking at me with a mixture of immense guilt and heartbreaking hesitation. For so long, she had been the passive observer in her own life, letting men like my father and then my uncle dictate the narrative because it was easier than fighting back. "You don't have to do that, Eleanor," my mother whispered, her voice fragile and raw from crying. "I can clean it. It's the least I can do." "It's all right, Mom. I needed something to do with my hands," I replied softly, turning off the faucet and wiping my hands on a dish towel. I pulled out one of the wooden bar stools at the kitchen island and gently patted the seat next to me. She walked over slowly, sitting down as if the chair might collapse underneath her. "I failed you," she said, the words tumbling out of her in a sudden, desperate rush. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. "I failed both of my daughters. I sat at that table for years and let Richard poison this family because I was too terrified of the conflict. When your father died, I felt so entirely lost. And Richard was right there, offering to handle everything. I let him take over the finances, the trust, the decisions. I saw the way he spoke about you, the way he turned Claire's grief into anger. And I did nothing. I was a coward. Eleanor, I am so deeply sorry." I reached out and held her hands. They were trembling, cold to the touch. "Mom, you were grieving," I told her and foot her, my voice steady, offering the grace she desperately needed but hadn't asked for. Richard was a predator. He looked for the cracks in this family's foundation, and he drove a wedge right into them. You were manipulated by someone you were supposed to be able to trust, but the secrecy ends today. The passivity ends today. We are going to audit the estate. We are going to fix the trust. And we are going to start talking to each other. Real talking. No more intermediaries. And no more hiding behind closed doors. Just then, the kitchen door creaked open further, and Claire walked in. She was no longer wearing the rigid, intimidating police uniform. Instead, she wore an oversized, faded college sweatshirt and sweatpants, looking remarkably like the vulnerable teenager she had been when I first left for basic training. Her eyes were swollen and red, a clear testament to a sleepless night spent wrestling with her own demons. She hesitated by the refrigerator, looking between my mother and me, unsure of where she fit into this newly dismantled family dynamic. I didn't wait for her to ask for permission. I stood up, walked over to the cabinet, and pulled down 3 ceramic coffee mugs. I poured the dark, steaming coffee, passing one to my mother and holding the other out to Claire. She took it, her fingers brushing against mine, a small silent bridge built over a decade of turbulent waters. We sat there together in the quiet kitchen, watching the sunrise paint the frost-covered lawn in shades of gold and pink. It wasn't a magical, immediate cure for all the pain we had inflicted upon one another, but it was a beginning. It was the first time in my life that the 3 of us were existing in the exact same reality, grounded in truth, and finally ready to do the incredibly hard work of healing. A week had passed since the Thanksgiving dinner that ripped our family apart and ultimately stitched it back together. The biting chill of December had firmly settled over upstate New York, freezing the branches of the ancient oaks and dusting the rooftops with a fine layer of white snow. My temporary leave was coming to an end, and the demanding reality of my post in Washington was calling me back. The days following the arrest had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings and painful revelations. Major Sarah Hayes had been flawless in her execution, with the genuine financial logs in federal custody. Uncle Richard was formally indicted on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The local precinct, severely embarrassed by Captain Miller's report, immediately suspended Richard's access to the town's political circles. The man who had spent years manipulating our family's narrative was now sitting in a county jail cell, stripped of his tailored suits and his fabricated power. As I packed my bags in my childhood bedroom, I looked around at the faded floral wallpaper and the old track and field trophies collecting dust on the shelves. This room used to feel like a prison I had desperately escaped. Now, it just felt like a chapter of a book I had finally finished reading. I zipped my duffel bag and carried it down the stairs. My mother and Claire were waiting for me in the foyer. The atmosphere between us had fundamentally shifted over the past 7 days. We had spent hours sitting by the fireplace, going through the painful process of untangling Richard's financial mess, but more importantly, untangling the emotional knots he had tied between us. Claire had taken a voluntary leave of absence from the police force, deciding to seek professional counseling to work through the crushing burnout and resentment that had led her to such a dark, desperate place. She looked lighter, the harsh, defensive posture she had carried for years finally beginning to soften. "You have everything," Claire asked, stepping forward to help me with my heavy winter coat. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies and a desperate desire to rebuild our bond. "I have everything I need," I smiled, adjusting the collar of my coat. I turned to my mother, pulling her into a long, tight embrace. She felt stronger today, her spine straighter, her eyes clearer. "I'll call you when I land. Mom, Sarah is going to have her legal team finalize the transfer of the estate back into your name by next week. You don't have to worry about a single thing. You're safe. I know I am," she whispered, kissing my cheek. "Because of you. Thank you, Eleanor, for coming back, for not giving up on us, even when we gave you every reason to." I turned to Claire. We stood facing each other. 2 sisters who had walked completely different paths, survived entirely different wars, and somehow managed to find our way back to the same front porch. She didn't offer a stiff handshake or a sarcastic remark. Instead, she wrapped her arms around my shoulders, burying her face in my coat. I held her back fiercely, resting to my chin on her head, silently promising her that the miles between Washington and Willow Creek would no longer dictate the distance between our hearts. I'm going to do better. Eleanor! Claire murmured against my shoulder, her voice thick with emotion. I'm going to get my head right. I want to be the sister you actually deserve. You already are. Claire, I told her firmly, stepping back to look her directly in the eyes. You always were. You just lost your way in the dark for a little while. But you found the light again. That takes more courage than you know. Keep doing the work. I'm always going to be in your corner, walking out to the rental car. The freezing morning air felt crisp and remarkably clean in my lungs. I tossed my bag into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked at the rearview mirror. My mother and sister were standing side by side on the porch, wrapped in thick sweaters, waving goodbye. I raised my hand, offering a final wave before turning the corner and leaving the white colonial house behind. As the highway stretched out before me, a profound sense of peace settled deep into my bones. The military had taught me how to command armies, how to dismantle threats, and how to survive the unthinkable. But it was my family that taught me the most vital lesson of all. True strength is not defined by how thoroughly you can destroy those who have wronged you. It is defined by your capacity to show mercy, establish boundaries without building walls, and to recognize the wounded humanity in the people who hurt you. Healing is not a destination. It is a daily, deliberate choice. It is the conscious decision to drop the armor, to sit at the table, and to simply say, I am here, and I am not leaving. As the city skyline eventually rose in the distance, welcoming me back to my duty, I smiled. For the first time in my life, I was returning to the battlefield not to run away from my home, but knowing I finally had one to come back to. The arrival of spring in Washington, D.C. is never subtle. It sweeps across the city with a sudden, vibrant intensity, turning the barren, gray landscape of winter into a brilliant canopy of pink cherry blossoms along the Potomac River. Sitting in my office on the 4th floor of the Pentagon, I watched the pale petals drift through the crisp morning air, carried by a gentle breeze that finally felt warm. 6 months had passed since that fateful Thanksgiving dinner in Willow Creek. In the military, 6 months is enough time to deploy an entire division, build a forward operating base, or dismantle a hostile regime. But when it comes to the deep, intricate wounds of family trauma, half a year is barely enough time to lay down the foundation for a new beginning. I turned my attention back to the classified dossier on my mahogany desk, but the sharp knock on my door pulled me from my strategic analysis. Major Sarah Hayes stepped into the office, holding 2 steaming cups of black coffee and a thick legal binder. She looked exactly as she always did, sharp, professional, and entirely unfazed by the immense pressure of our intelligence unit. She handed me a cup, her eyes softening as she placed the heavy binder on the corner of my desk. The federal prosecutors just sent over the final plea agreement for your uncle, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a respectful, quiet register. Richard is going to serve a minimum of 7 years in federal prison for the embezzlement of the family trust, wire fraud, and the forgery of government documents. He tried to negotiate a lighter sentence by offering to pay back a fraction of what he stole, but the judge firmly denied the motion. The estate's assets have been fully legally transferred back to your mother's sole control. I let out a long, slow exhale, feeling a massive, invisible weight finally lift from my shoulders. Thank you, Sarah, I murmured, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. For everything. You didn't just help me protect my family's financial security. You helped me give them their lives back. That is what true allies do. General, Sarah smiled warmly, tapping the binder. But that is not the only reason I am interrupting your morning. You have a visitor waiting for you at the security checkpoint downstairs. She says she has a scheduled tour of the National Mall with the most decorated tour guide in the city. A genuine smile broke across my face. I grabbed my trench coat, leaving the classified files locked securely in my desk drawer. When I reached the main visitor center, Claire was standing near the glass turnstiles. The transformation in her was nothing short of breathtaking. She was no longer wearing the heavy, defensive armor of her police uniform, nor the exhausted, defeated posture of the woman I had left in November. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, a bright turquoise scarf, and a relaxed, genuinely peaceful expression. The dark circles under her eyes had completely vanished, replaced by a vibrant spark that I hadn't seen since we were teenagers. We embraced instantly, a warm, tight hug that held no hesitation and no lingering resentment. We spent the afternoon walking along the tidal basin, the iconic monuments casting long, majestic shadows across the reflecting pools. The air was filled with the low hum of tourists and the rustling of the cherry blossoms, providing a beautiful, neutral background for a conversation we desperately needed to have. Claire told me about her intensive therapy sessions, detailing the painful process of unlearning the toxic behaviors Uncle Richard had instilled in her. She spoke about her decision to officially resign from the police force, realizing that her desire for a badge had been rooted in a desperate need for control and validation, rather than a genuine calling to serve. It was terrifying, Eleanor, Claire admitted, looking out over the rippling water toward the Jefferson Memorial. For my entire adult life, I thought my worth was tied to how much authority I could project, and how perfectly I could manage Mom's life. When Richard manipulated me into turning against you, he used my deepest insecurities. Therapy has been like taking a sledgehammer to my own ego. I had to finally look in the mirror and admit that I was deeply broken, deeply jealous, and completely exhausted. Vulnerability is terrifying because it requires you to drop the shield, I replied softly, linking my arm through hers. But a shield doesn't just keep the bad things out. Claire, it keeps the good things out, too. You cannot receive love, grace, or true connection if you are constantly braced for an attack. You did the hardest part. You chose to stop fighting a war that was destroying you from the inside. Claire leaned her head against my shoulder as we walked, the physical closeness a testament to the immense emotional distance we had crossed. I am going back to school, she said, a hint of nervous excitement in her voice. I want to get my degree in social work. I want to help families who are dealing with elder abuse and financial manipulation. I want to take the worst mistake of my life and turn it into something that actually protects people. I stopped walking and looked at my sister, my heart swelling with an overwhelming sense of pride. The anger and the betrayal of that Thanksgiving dinner felt like a distant, faded nightmare. In its place stood a remarkable woman who had chosen the grueling path of accountability and healing over the easy road of bitterness. You are going to be incredible, I told her, squeezing her hand. You are already a hero, Claire, not because of a badge, but because you had the courage to change. A year later, the harsh chill of November returned, but the atmosphere it brought was entirely different. Instead of driving down the anxiety-ridden, leaf-strewn roads of upstate New York, I was standing in the spacious, brightly lit kitchen of my home in Alexandria, Virginia. The scent of roasted turkey, fresh rosemary, and baking apples filled the air. But this time, there was no underlying current of dread. There were no hidden agendas, no forged documents, and no toxic men waiting to manipulate the narrative. This Thanksgiving, I was hosting, and the house was filled with the sounds of genuine, unfiltered joy. My mother, Margaret, was sitting at the kitchen island, laughing brightly as she chopped pecans for the pie. The past year had given her a new lease on life. With Uncle Richard firmly behind bars and her financial independence fully restored, the heavy shroud of anxiety that had defined her existence had vanished. She had joined a local gardening club, started painting again, and finally learned how to navigate her own bank accounts with confidence. Watching her reclaim her agency and her dignity was one of the most beautiful victories I had ever witnessed. It was a stark reminder that it is never too late to take your power back, and that human dignity is a fundamental right that must be fiercely protected, especially for the elderly. Claire walked into the kitchen, carrying a stack of fine china plates, her face glowing with a healthy, vibrant energy. She was halfway through her first semester of her social work program and was thriving in a way I had always hoped for her. She set the table with a meticulous, loving care, stopping occasionally to show Mom a picture on her phone or to tease me about my overly strict roasting schedule. Captain Robert Miller, who had remained a steadfast friend and an incredible ally, was also joining us for dinner, standing by the fireplace with a glass of apple cider, engaged in a lively debate with Major Sarah Hayes about military history. When it was time to sit down and eat, I looked around the large mahogany table. The contrast between this moment and the nightmare of the previous year was profound. No one was bracing for an insult. No one was clutching their napkin in terror. We were simply a family, deeply flawed, heavily scarred, but ultimately unbroken. I picked up my wine glass, tapping it gently with my spoon to gather everyone's attention. The room fell into a comfortable, respectful silence. I am not usually one for long speeches outside of a briefing room. I began, my voice steady and filled with an immense, grounding warmth. But this year, I have something important to say. A year ago, this family was pushed to the absolute brink, tested by greed, by manipulation, and by the toxic belief that power is defined by dominance. But we survived because we chose a different path. We chose to believe that true power is rooted in mercy. We chose to believe that forgiveness, while incredibly difficult, is the ultimate form of strength. I looked directly at Claire, who was watching me with tears glistening in her eyes. We learned that equality and respect are not just political concepts. They are the daily practices that keep a family alive. We learned to communicate without weapons and to love without conditions. I am so incredibly thankful for my mother's resilience. I am thankful for my sister's profound courage to seek the truth and heal her heart. And I am thankful for the friends who stood by us when the darkness felt overwhelming. To family, Claire whispered, raising her glass high, her voice carrying a strong, undeniable conviction, the one we fought for, and the one we saved. To family, the rest of the table echoed in unison, the crystal glasses clinking together in a harmonious, beautiful chime. As the evening wore on, filled with laughter, shared memories, and a profound sense of safety, I stepped out onto the back porch to take a breath of the crisp night air. The stars were shining brilliantly against the velvet black sky. I thought about the thousands of people who might be sitting at their own hostile dinner tables, feeling trapped by family secrets, financial abuse, or toxic manipulation. If my journey had taught me anything, it was that you do not have to accept the role that a dysfunctional family assigns to you. You have the right to set boundaries. You have the right to demand respect. And most importantly, you have the right to walk away from the war and build a peace of your own making. True peace is never found by destroying the people who hurt you. It is found when you no longer need them to validate your worth. As I stood there in the quiet cold, looking back through the glass door at the glowing warmth of my home and the beautiful, smiling faces of the women I loved, I knew the battle was finally over. The silence no longer felt like exile. It felt like freedom. 2 years had passed since the Thanksgiving dinner that had fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of our lives. And the relentless march of time had brought with it a profound sense of renewal. The stifling humidity of late May hung over the sprawling, ivy-covered campus of Georgetown University, the air vibrating with the electric anticipation of commencement day. I sat in the front row of the grand outdoor amphitheater, the crisp, dark fabric of my dress uniform pressing against my shoulders, the gold stars of my rank gleaming quietly in the morning sun. Beside me sat my mother, Margaret, looking radiant in a soft yellow sundress, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. We were not here for a military briefing, nor were we attending a diplomatic summit. We were here to witness a victory that meant more to me than any battlefield triumph I had ever commanded. We were here to watch my sister, Claire, graduate with her master's degree in social work, graduating at the very top of her class, watching the sea of students file into the amphitheater, clothed in their traditional black gowns and vibrant academic hoods. My mind wandered back to the bitter, defensive woman who had once stood in a police uniform, holding a pair of handcuffs and a heart full of manufactured hatred. The contrast was staggering. The journey Claire had undertaken over the past 24 months was nothing short of miraculous. But it had not been easy. Therapy had stripped away her deepest defenses, forcing her to confront the ugly, uncomfortable truths about her own insecurities and the insidious nature of the manipulation she had endured. She had spent countless nights at my kitchen table in Virginia, crying over textbooks, wrestling with the heavy emotional toll of her chosen field, and slowly rebuilding her sense of self-worth from the ground up. She had learned that true authority does not come from a badge, a weapon, or the ability to intimidate others. True authority comes from the unwavering commitment to protect the vulnerable, to advocate for the voiceless, and to stand as a shield for those who cannot defend themselves. When the dean of the college called Claire's name, the sound echoed clearly across the manicured lawns. My mother let out a joyful, unrestrained cheer, her eyes welling with proud tears. I stood up, rendering a sharp, respectful salute, a gesture usually reserved for high-ranking officers, but one I now offered entirely to my sister. Claire walked across the wooden stage, accepting her diploma with a beaming, radiant smile that illuminated her entire face. She looked down at us, her eyes locking onto mine, and mouthed the words, "Thank you." In that fleeting, beautiful moment, the last lingering ghosts of our fractured past evaporated into the warm summer breeze. The cycle of generational trauma, of silence, and of toxic familial control had been definitively broken. We had not just survived the fire Uncle Richard had set in our home. We had used the ashes to forge something incredibly strong and entirely unbreakable. Following the ceremony, the campus lawns transformed into a chaotic sea of celebrating families, flying graduation caps, and endless photographs. Claire pushed through the crowd, her black gown billowing behind her, and threw her arms around my neck. The embrace was fierce and grounded, holding none of the fragile hesitation that used to define our relationship. As we pulled away, Claire turned to introduce us to a woman standing quietly nearby. It was Mrs. Higgins, a 70-year-old widow whom Claire had been assigned to during her clinical internship. Mrs. Higgins had been the victim of severe financial abuse at the hands of her own nephew, a situation chillingly identical to what our mother had experienced. Claire had tirelessly advocated for her, navigating the complex legal and social systems to freeze the stolen assets, secure protective orders, and ultimately restore the woman's financial independence and personal dignity. General Vance. "Margaret," Claire said, her voice brimming with a quiet, powerful confidence. "I want you to meet Eleanor Higgins. She is the reason I know I am in exactly the right profession, Mrs." Higgins reached out, taking my mother's hands in her own. There was a profound, silent understanding that passed between the two older women, a shared recognition of survival. As I watched my sister gently guide Mrs. Higgins through the bustling crowd, ensuring she was safe and comfortable, I felt a deep, resonant peace settle into my chest. Claire was taking the absolute worst, most agonizing chapter of our family's history and weaponizing it for good. She was using her pain as a blueprint to rescue others from the dark. This was the true essence of human rights and equality, the fundamental belief that every single person, regardless of their age or vulnerability, deserves to live free from exploitation and fear. We had fought a grueling war within the walls of our own home, but looking at the woman my sister had become, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that the victory was absolute. By the time October rolled around, painting the Virginia countryside in breathtaking shades of amber and crimson, the final remnants of our old life in Willow Creek were ready to be laid to rest. With Claire fully established in her new career in Washington, D.C. and my mother spending the majority of her time tending to the gardens at my home in Alexandria, the large, white colonial house upstate had become nothing more than an empty, echoing shell. It was a monument to a past we no longer inhabited. We had made the collective decision to sell the estate, to liquidate the final physical ties to a place that held as much sorrow as it did history. On a crisp, overcast Friday morning, Claire and I drove up to New York one last time to oversee the final walkthrough and hand the heavy brass keys over to the new owners. Walking through the empty rooms, the house felt surprisingly small. The grand furniture, the antique rugs, and the imposing portraits that used to define the space had all been boxed up, sold, or donated, without the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of Uncle Richard's presence and my father's rigid expectations. It was just wood, drywall, and glass. Claire and I stood in the center of the bare dining room, our footsteps echoing against the polished hardwood floors. This was the exact spot where the table had been. This was the exact spot where Claire had thrown the forged documents down, where the handcuffs had clicked around my wrists, and where Captain Miller had delivered the salute that shattered our family's toxic illusions. I looked down at the floorboards, tracing the faint scratches left behind by the old dining chairs, and took a slow, grounding breath. "It feels different," Claire whispered, her voice bouncing softly off the empty walls. She was wearing a casual gray sweater and jeans, her posture relaxed, devoid of the defensive tension she used to carry in this room. "I always thought this house was haunted, haunted by Dad's expectations, by Richard's greed, by my own jealousy. But standing here now, it's just an empty room. Ghosts only have power if you invite them to the table." "Claire," I replied, turning to face her with a gentle smile. "We stopped inviting them. We stopped feeding the resentment and the fear. The house isn't haunted anymore because we took our spirits back." We walked through the kitchen, the sunlight streaming through the bare windows, casting long, clean shadows across the linoleum. There was no sadness in the departure. There was no lingering tragedy. There was only the profound realization that walking away from toxic environments is one of the most empowering acts of self-preservation a human being can undertake. Society often demands relentless loyalty to family, pushing a narrative that biological ties must be maintained regardless of the emotional cost. But education and emotional intelligence teach us that true family is built on mutual respect, unwavering safety, and the courage to hold one another accountable. We had done the grueling work of holding each other accountable, and in doing so, we had earned the right to walk out of this front door with our heads held high. Stepping out onto the front porch, the brisk autumn wind rustled through the oak trees, sending a shower of golden leaves drifting down onto the driveway. The new owners, a young couple with a toddler, pulled up in a moving truck, their faces bright with the innocent excitement of starting a new chapter. We handed over the keys, offering them warm smiles and sincere wishes for a happy life within these walls. As Claire and I walked back to my car, I felt a profound sense of closure locking into place. The story of the Vance family was no longer a tragedy about manipulation and betrayal. It was a testament to the fact that people can change, that deeply ingrained cycles of abuse can be halted, and that forgiveness is a weapon far more powerful than vengeance. I started the engine, the low hum of the motor breaking the quiet of the suburban street. Claire reached over and turned up the radio, a soft acoustic melody filling the cabin of the car. I put the vehicle in drive and pulled away from the curb, not looking back at the house in the rearview mirror. Our future was not behind us. It was waiting in Washington, in the quiet dignity of my mother's garden, in the families Claire would go on to save, and in the quiet, unshakable peace I had finally found within myself. As the town of Willow Creek faded into the distance, I knew that the silence of the open road was no longer the silence of exile. It was the sound of absolute, unconditional freedom. As the dust settles on Eleanor's story, the most profound takeaway isn't that deeply satisfying moment of karma when the police captain saluted her. The real victory lies in what happened after the handcuffs came off. We live in a world that constantly tells us to cancel people, to instantly cut off anyone who offends us, and to view forgiveness as a sign of weakness. But this story challenges that narrative. When Eleanor looked at the sister who had just tried to destroy her life, she didn't see a villain, she saw a broken, exhausted woman who had been manipulated by a greedy uncle. Eleanor had every legal right to send her sister to prison and end her career. Instead, she chose compassion. This story teaches us that true strength is the architecture of forgiveness. It requires immense emotional intelligence to recognize when someone is acting out of deep-seated fear and insecurity rather than pure malice. Setting healthy boundaries with toxic family members is absolutely necessary. Eleanor made sure her uncle faced federal prison for his financial abuse against their mother. But setting a boundary doesn't always mean building an impenetrable wall. Sometimes, it means holding the line while keeping the door unlocked for those who are willing to do the hard work of changing. Moreover, this is a stark reminder to protect the vulnerable. Financial abuse within families thrives in silence and secrecy. By bringing the truth to light, Eleanor not only reclaimed her own dignity, but rescued her mother's future. Remember, peace is not found when you finally prove you were right. Peace is found when you no longer need toxic people to validate your worth, and you choose to build a life defined by grace instead of anger. If Eleanor's journey resonated with you today, or if you found comfort in her strength, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with a friend or a family member who might need a reminder that their peace is their greatest power. We would also love to hear from you. Have you ever had to navigate a difficult betrayal or set a hard boundary with a loved one? Share your story in the comments below. This community is here to listen. This content has been researched, developed, and edited manually by us to deliver meaningful lessons.